Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Catherine Brobeck.
I'm Kemper Donovan.
And we are covering some Poirot. Barely. I'm going to spoiler alert here. There's very little Poirot in this, but Poirot nevertheless. What are we covering, Kemper?
Cat Among the Pigeons. I'm very excited,
Ooh.
Catherine.
Yeah, it's a very good title, and I have to say, overall, an enjoyable read, but we'll get to that.
We will indeed. Shall I tell us a little bit about the publication history, Catherine?
Please do.
Cat Among the Pigeons was first serialized in the UK in the weekly magazine John Bull. We've heard of that one before, in 6 abridged installments from September to October 1959. Then in the US, a condensed version of the novel appeared in a single issue in November of 1959 of the Ladies' Home Journal. That must have been quite a condensed version of the novel. Then,
it's not actually that short.
Yeah, it's not that short of a novel, but I guess also magazines were longer back then, perhaps. In book form, it was first published in the UK by Collins Crime Club, of course, in November of 1959. And then in March of 1960, that's right, 1960, we're in the swinging 60s, folks. It was published in the US by Dodd Mead. We are moving along into a new decade.
We are.
Before we get into the substance of the story and our usual breakdown, I just have a couple of little tidbits, as I so often do. Mm-hmm. The title, Cat Among the Pigeons, which does get checked in the book 6 times, I counted.
Right.
It's like what we like to refer to at this point, Catherine, as the face-off effect.
I'd like to take his face off.
Yeah, of course.
Right.
Or welcome to Jurassic Park.
Welcome to Jurassic Park.
Yes. 6 separate times in this book, characters say cat among the pigeons, which is very unusual for Christie. Like, usually
it's actually mentioned at one point by the inspector, who says, "That's really funny. Somebody else just said that."
Yeah, there's a lot of awareness, I think, of the phrase, and it's just such a suggestive title, so I don't blame her for just like having a lot of fun with it. Interestingly, John Curran actually cites Ordeal by Innocence as an alternate title for this book, and we discussed in our episode on Ordeal by Innocence how Cat Among the Pigeons was an alternate title for that novel, so obviously she was considering both titles simultaneously. But this is also interesting. There's another alternate title that she was considering, which was Death of a Games Mistress. And that title also gets checked in the book by our Inspector d'Histoire, Inspector Kelsey, and he notes that it's a likely sounding thriller title. So I like that she worked that alternate title into the book as well. And then the only fun fact I have as to the provenance of this book is that we know from Agatha Christie's notebooks, as of course conveyed to us by John Curran in his wonderful books, that when Christie was first making notes for this book, she considered making it a Miss Marple story. What she wrote when she was kind of pondering this idea was Miss Marple, great niece at the school. And it is a little bit of a mystery why she didn't go in the Miss Marple direction, honestly, because it would have been pretty organic to insert her.
Yeah, in all honesty, it seems much more like a Miss Marple story than it does a Poirot, doesn't it?
It does. This is definitely one, sometimes you're just like, oh my God, I can't even imagine, like the fact that Miss Marple was considered for Death on the Nile. I remember it was just shocking to even imagine that.
No, it doesn't make any sense. And here's the thing, Poirot's existence in this ends up making a lot of sense, but it also feels like perhaps Miss Marple would have been better incorporated into it.
I think she would have been more organically incorporated into it. This is actually what John Curran had to say about it, which I thought was perceptive as usual. He said, Miss Marple having a relative in the school is more credible than a schoolgirl escaping to consult Poirot, and Meadowbank is a girls' school. That said, Miss Marple had already had a busy decade with 4 major investigations and another minor one, and she would not perhaps have been as adept with the international segment. And that's fair enough as to the international intrigue, that is where it's a slightly better fit with Poirot. But it's just interesting to imagine this as a Miss Marple novel. And, we'll discuss this a lot throughout the episode, I think, but there's a lot to celebrate in this book, and one of our longtime listeners actually emailed us and called it a quote unquote turducken of a novel, which is, you know, a little bit of a holiday themed way to describe this book. 'Tis the holidays. So I thought I would share that with you all because I think it's a really apt description because, you know, there is a lot going on in this book, much as there is a lot going on in a turducken. And at times it's a bit much. It's a little too rich, maybe even a little ridiculous, but also pretty tasty and delicious and satisfying. Like, I actually am a big fan of this book, even though I by no means consider it a perfect novel or one of the Christie crown jewels. Are you a big fan of
the turducken, Kemper?
I would not say no to a turducken.
You know, I think I said to you, Kemper, I found this book a little bit of an oddity.
Indeed. In good and bad ways.
Correct. Yes.
All right. Well, let's get into it. Could you tell us a little bit about the victims in Cat Among the Pigeons, Catherine?
So we have Prince Ali Yusuf. He's a reformer heir to the throne of Ramat in the Middle East. Ramat is a obviously fictional kingdom, but he's worried about a revolution by hardliners, and he ends up dying in a plane crash with who?
Bob Rawlins, a sincere, daringly brave young English pilot who Prince Ali went to public school with in England. And they've just been, you know, BFFs ever since. And he also dies in that plane crash trying to get Prince Ali Yusuf and himself out of Ramat. This, by the way, I mean, the revolution that's happening is very much based on the revolution that happened on the 14th of July, 1958 in Iraq. And that revolution ended up in the execution of the king and prime minister of Iraq. Christie, you know, in that she obviously was very familiar with the area and visited it regularly, was very much aware of what was happening. So we definitely have a lot of Middle Eastern international intrigue going on here in this book. That would be, you know, the turkey of the turducken.
Correct. We also then have Miss Grace Springer, the games mistress. So hence the alternate title that Christie was considering. Games mistress sounds possibly like you could go out like hunting stag with her, but she's a gym teacher at this very elite English girls' school, Meadowbank School, and she's killed with a gunshot wound to the heart.
And, you know, we regret to inform you that there are more deaths to come, but we're not going to spoil them. There are some more schoolmistresses who might be meeting a grisly end before we are done with this episode.
Yep.
So, speaking of schoolmistresses, let's talk about our suspects, because said schoolmistresses are really our only suspects. You know, it's the teachers and staff at this school, which is called Meadowbank, and there are a lot of them. So let's start at the top. We've got Miss Bulstrode, the headmistress and co-founder of the school, who is exceptionally well-respected and an innovative educator, just a top drawer sort of person. All the characters seem to just be in raptures about her from beginning to end of the book, and we are definitely supposed to believe them. This is a character Christie herself seems to admire very much.
Right. And so she almost can't be considered a suspect because in reality, she is never at any point considered a suspect.
Yeah, it's true.
But we're going to list her here anyway.
Christie, though.
No, you never know. So we also have her second in command, Miss Chatty, who's her co-founder of the school. She's the maths teacher. You know, she's kind of the person who steps in and actually rigidly enforces everything at Meadowbank. Not because she's like harsh. She's not like some old-fashioned schoolmistress with a ruler. She just is the person who puts everybody back into the place that they're supposed to be.
I love how Miss Bulstrode herself puts it, because we get a lot of Miss Bulstrode's internal thoughts in the book, and she thinks to herself, faithful Chatty, always to be relied upon, whether it was a severed artery or an intoxicated parent. Sure.
I know. It's just, yeah, she's just really on the ball.
She's a little bit, even though she's not actually a companion to Miss Bulstrode, she is a little bit the companion character that we've seen in previous Christie novels. You know, she's a bit dependent and doting upon Miss Bulstrode. So I got a definite Dora Bunner vibe. I also got a little bit of, and I know others have as well, of a Miss Hinchcliffe, Miss Murgatroyd, you know, quasi-lesbian situation going on here, at least in the direction of Miss Chadwick to Miss Bulstrode in terms of Miss Chadwick's regard.
Yeah, I don't know that it goes the other way.
Yeah, but there does seem to be a bit of that. So Dora Bunner crossed with Miss Murgatroyd, if you will. So next up, Miss Johnson, who is the matron in charge of the girls. Then we have a new French teacher this term. Her name is Mademoiselle Angèle Blanche. And who else do we have, Catherine?
Miss Anne Shopland, who's a new secretary to Miss Bulstrode, and she's also new this term along with Mademoiselle Blanche.
Then we have Miss Vansittart, who is the heir apparent to the headmistress job. She's, you could call her a bit of a wet rag. People sort of make fun of her a little bit because she always seems to be kind of doing a paltry imitation of Miss Bulstrode, but she's extremely competent and good at her job. She just very much models herself after Miss Bulstrode. Incidentally, Vansittart was the name of a street in Torquay. Christie used the names of streets and places to name her characters all the time. So this is just one of those examples.
And last but not least at all, we have Miss Wretch, who is the English teacher, who she's only been there 18 months. She took last term off because she was ill, but she's adored by her students, like adored. Because she's wonderfully engaging. She's very young. She's a little bit odd. She's described as equally as being like kind of ugly, but then when people look at her again, they think she's kind of strikingly beautiful in a weird way. Like there's something about her that's interesting.
All right, well, let's talk about the world as it appears to be. We start off with the first day of the fall term at Meadowbank. All the girls are coming to the school, and it's, the normal hectic sort of business associated with that first day of school. And we meet a mother, Mrs. Upjohn, and her very put-together daughter, Julia. And Mrs. Upjohn is kind of babbling away a bit while Miss Bulstrode is distracted by the presence of a very drunken member of the aristocracy who has decided to escape her husband and come looking for her daughter. She apparently almost got into an automobile accident on the way over and is basically about to fall down drunk. A large part, I think, of the power of Christie's portrayal of Miss Bulstrode is that we are privy to her internal monologue, especially on this first day. And she's really funny and incisive and biting as to her thoughts on the mothers.
She says about the drunken mother that it's a terrible pity because the daughters are so nice.
Yeah. Well, you get the sense too. I mean, she's in the right field for herself because she has a real affection for children, right? Or for adolescent girls who are being formed into women, but she doesn't really have a lot of patience for the clinging, cloying mothers, and she kind of can't wait for them to leave. And it's a really refreshing portrayal too, because, she is anything but a schoolmarm. She's a really brilliant, interesting, deft
kind of like cool
thinker.
Educator, to be honest. Like she seems to have like really good relationships also with men in power, which is fascinating.
She's very well connected. She picks up on the fact that someone's wearing Balenciaga. I liked that.
I know.
She's a Renaissance woman.
She's kind of like a remarkable figure. She's a really, really well-drawn character.
Yeah, and Christie often, Christie does very well with those sorts of characters. I mean, it put me in mind of Lucy Anketel in The Hollow. She's another one of those sorts of characters, or even Clarissa in Spider's Web. These kind of just like larger than life, uber charming, uber competent older women. In any case, while she's distracted by all this, and Miss Chadwick, of course, is the one who comes over and saves that whole situation with the drunken mother, Mrs. Upjohn has been babbling away about her work in the war as a member of the Foreign Office / an intelligence officer, and how it seems to have something to do with the school. Like maybe she saw someone or something that reminded her of her work in the Foreign Service. But honestly, unfortunately,
it's a rare lapse from Miss Bulstrode because she knows it too.
Exactly. She has this sense that, I just missed something important, but oh well, she can't ask Mrs. Upjohn to repeat the last 10 minutes of conversation. So she kind of just lets it go.
Right. So then we cut back to the recent past in Ramat, and we meet Prince Ali Yusuf, who is, again, as we said, he's a very smart, well-meaning reformer, and his best friend / his personal pilot is Bob Rollins, and they're having a debate about how they can escape from Ramat. It seems clear they've already tried to, and there was mechanical errors, which seemed like sabotage. And the entire country seems on the brink of this revolution. And they put together this plan to fly out. But first, Prince Ali Yusuf decides to entrust Bob with something that he always keeps on his person, much like his father did before him, which is a bag of precious gems worth somewhere between $750,000 and $1 million. And he asks Bob to please make sure there's some way to get it out of the country.
So Bob is running out of time here as to the jewels, and he goes to the Ritz Savoy Hotel where his sister, a Mrs. Sutcliffe, is staying, but unfortunately she's out. So he goes to her room, and he's basically just looking for a hiding place for these gems, and he's rooting around in her luggage before he finally sees that his niece, Mrs. Sutcliffe's daughter Jennifer, has a plasticine kit and some sports equipment. And we have seen Christie use plasticine as a hiding place so many times before at this point. We saw it in a Parker Pine short story, The Pearl of Price. We also saw it in Murder in Mesopotamia, and they came to Baghdad. And, you know, none of those are major spoilers. If you haven't read any of those novels, have no fear. You'll be able to enjoy them just fine. So after he kind of does whatever he does, we don't exactly see what he does in the room and where he hides these jewels, but we know that that was his aim. After that is done, he leaves a note casually asking his sister to golf later in the day. And then he makes a phone call to the British embassy, and basically he is trying to pass along the information as to where he hid these jewels to someone in an official capacity within the British government so that, you know, they can retrieve them once they've gone to Europe with his sister and niece's luggage.
Suffice it to say, he's not able to convey that message before the revolutionaries begin pouring into the streets, and he has to beat a hasty retreat via aeroplane with Prince Ali Yusuf. So we know the jewels are hidden somewhere in his sister and niece's belongings inside some plasticine, and we know that no one other than Bob knows where they are. Except we see that there's a woman in the next room over who happened to be out on her balcony tweezing, quote, a single hair that had had the audacity to spring up on her chin. And while she's dealing with that, this woman accidentally sees Bob Rawlinson through the window in the room over and watches him very carefully. And after Bob leaves the room, this unknown woman leaves her room, picks the lock of the Sutcliffe's room, and is seemingly about to retrieve the jewels wherever she saw them hidden when she's interrupted by Mrs. Sutcliffe complaining loudly of the fact that the British consulate is hurrying them out of the country that very moment, meaning they're about to come back in the room. So this unnamed woman leaves without the jewels, but with the knowledge, obviously, of where they are.
And the Sutcliffes, mother and daughter, are taken out of the country immediately by plane as well.
Back in England, some weeks later, British intelligence gathering finds out that the plane carrying the prince and Bob has crashed. They had just been missing for a while. It was known that they had managed to get out of Ramat, but not to where. And then there was no tell of them anywhere, but the plane has been found and it's pretty clear who was on it. And it turns out there's nothing of value on their bodies and no sign of anything of what it was they were trying to hide. And so the Sutcliffes have come back to England via ship after they were flown out of Ramat to get to a ship. And then their house is also broken into and ransacked. And so the government essentially installs surveillance on the whole family.
They also install surveillance on Meadowbank because Prince Ali Yusuf's cousin, the Princess Shaista, will be attending there, as will Jennifer Sutcliffe. So that's convenient. Right. And the intelligence gathering is going to be done by this man whose real name apparently is Robbie, but he goes by Adam Goodman.
Possibly Robbie. We don't really know. They call him Robbie in the spy headquarters.
He goes by Adam Goodman for the duration of the novel. So that is what we shall be calling him. I like that he had originally
suggested Adam Eden.
Yeah. So he comes in as a gardening apprentice. That is his cover. And Jennifer who is smart but extremely unimaginative, is quickly becoming best friends with Julia Upjohn, who is both smart and very clever. There's a little bit of a Goofus and Gallant vibe going on with Jennifer and Julia that I actually really appreciated. Christie, is not very sparing in her criticisms of Jennifer, whereas Julia, it's very clear, is a wonderful, lovely child who is going to grow up into a lovely and wonderful woman.
Right. And clearly Julia's mother was probably really cool.
Yes, Julia's mother, obviously, having been a spy, even though she was babbling on and Miss Bulstrode wasn't listening to her, we do also get the sense that she's extremely cool. So just the two of them are like a very attractive mother-daughter pair, which very much, I think, contrasts with the mother-daughter pair of Jennifer and Mrs. Sutcliffe. They're just kind of like crabby with each other, and Mrs. Sutcliffe is constantly criticizing Jennifer. And even Bob Rollins says about his niece, a self-centered child who never saw or noticed anything outside herself.
Although it's mentioned a few times that she's exceptionally good at facts. She just is not very good at analysis or creativity. And her mother seems kind of awful. And her father is an incredibly boring industrialist who doesn't seem to care about mother or daughter.
Indeed. And she does seem to care an awful lot about tennis, sort of to the exclusion of anything else.
And food. She cares about food and tennis. And she really cares about food. We get very, very detailed descriptions of the food that Jennifer Sutcliffe eats in this book.
She's not a bad sort at all. It's just that Christie's depiction of her is charmingly unsentimental and unforgiving, which is unusual, for a depiction of a child, because she is still a child, but it's actually amusing.
Right. But so both Jennifer and Julia are very skilled tennis players. Skilled enough that Jennifer is like so cranky and keeps complaining about how her tennis racket was messed up by the heat of the Middle East and the balance is wrong. And Julia, she has a lesser racket that needs to be restrung a little bit. And she trades it with Jennifer because Jennifer is like, I'd rather have yours than mine that's off balance.
I wonder if Uncle Bob hid the jewels in Jennifer's tennis racket.
Gee, I wonder.
I mean, we often talk about astute readers having to make inferences. This does not require any astuteness on the reader's part.
No, it's pretty much spelled out very early on.
Yeah, well, that's why we're not going to be including it as a clue, because it's really not. We all know what's going on here pretty early on in the story. So one night, Miss Springer, the games mistress, is found murdered in the sports pavilion by a horrified Miss Chadwick and Miss Johnson. The latter having seen lights moving in the sports pavilion in the middle of the night. So they went to investigate, and that's when they discovered the body. They also called the police, and that is where our Inspector d'Histoire comes in. That would be Inspector Kelsey, who's, fine in this story.
Right.
And it's discovered that no one really much liked Miss Springer, who was an unself-aware busybody. Inspector Kelsey is also pretty quickly alerted by Adam Goodman himself that Adam is not really Adam, and he is in British intelligence, and that there is a lot more going on at Meadowbank than meets the eye, and probably this international espionage business having to do with jewels connects to the murder somehow.
Right. Well, I mean, we can guess because we already at this point know that the jewels are in the tennis racket, and the games mistress was killed at the sports pavilion where the tennis racket was. So, we do know how it connects. We just don't know who done it.
Precisely.
They do tell Miss Bulstrode, though. They loop her in.
Of course they do, because Miss Bulstrode is, not one to be uninformed.
Right. And so shortly after this, a woman approaches Jennifer to say, I'm just driving through here, and your Aunt Gina had asked her to bring this new racket because she'd heard that Jennifer had been frustrated by her racket, and, she'll just take Jennifer's back to be restrung. And Jennifer does not think twice about this. She is delighted to have a brand new fancy tennis racket. she immediately goes and tells Julia, who basically looks at her and says, "We didn't tell anybody that we'd switched rackets or anything that was wrong with your racket. Do you know this woman? Like, have you ever met this woman before? Did you tell anybody about your tennis racket?" And Jennifer is like, no.
Yeah, I mean, Julia exhibits some top quality critical thinking here. She applies it immediately to that. That I think is when I thought of the Goofus and Gallant comic strip that's in Highlights magazine, because it's like Goofus just accepts the tennis racket without asking a second question. Gallant asks a couple of questions and thinks, something might be amiss here. Because I think what the woman says is, "Oh, I heard that your racket needed to be restrung." And all Jennifer thinks is, "Yes, the racket in my hands does need to be restrung." But of course, Julia says, "That was my racket like 3 days ago. So how would your aunt have ever known that the racket you have now needs to be restrung?" So around this time, the Princess Shaista, who has had a lot to say about the fact that she thinks the murderer is actually going after her, and that all of this, mayhem is due to her own presence. And Inspector Kelsey just doesn't really believe her, thinks she has delusions of grandeur. But Princess Shaista is seemingly kidnapped when two different chauffeurs come to pick her up. She was, going to go out with her uncle, and it seems that the first car that came, which she just unknowingly entered and which whisked her away, was not, in fact, her uncle's car, and now she is nowhere to be found. To make matters much worse, Miss Vansittart is also killed in the sports pavilion. This time it's not a gunshot to the heart that kills this schoolmistress, but a sandbag over the head. It's actually gruesome in a different way. And, at this point, Miss Bulstrode has some really impressive command over the situation when it comes to the parents being in an understandable uproar as to the safety of their children at the school where people are getting murdered. She was able to sort of keep things tamped down. But after the second schoolmistress is killed, the parents understandably really do start taking their girls out of this school. So Jennifer at this point is pulled out. Julia, though, is not pulled out because Mrs. Upjohn is on a road trip via bus to Anatolia in Turkey. She's very much off the beaten path, so she cannot be tracked down. There's no mention of a Mr. Upjohn, so Julia has to stay because they can't get in touch with her mother. And I don't think it's reading too much into these two characters, this mother and daughter, to imagine that Christie was portraying an idealized version of herself and Rosalind, because we know that Christie was a big traveler and she often was the mother who wasn't on top of her child and was jetting off to the Middle East and other places and very busy with her career. And, Julia seems to be a pretty well-adjusted kid for that. We've talked a lot about how Christie doesn't really think that possessive, cloying love between a mother and child is a good thing. So this is really like the idealized version of that. It's actually kind of sweet.
And as we've mentioned before, Julia is exceptionally bright too.
No, it's actually nice because both Mrs. Upjohn and Julia are drawn with a lot of affection, and it almost seems as if Christie was writing a love letter to the best version of her relationship with Rosalind with these two characters. Like I actually found it.
That's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that, but that seems actually sort of right, especially because of Mrs. Upjohn's very odd bus trip.
I actually have textual proof drawing from another book as to that, but that's going to be my little suspense for you, Catherine, as we get further into this plot summary.
We should then mention that Julia, staying put, she's already thought something was up with the tennis racket, and clearly the sports pavilion is a point of focus. And she's taken the tennis racket with her, so it's not in the sports pavilion anymore. She has it, and she's hidden it under her mattress. And under the cover of darkness, she pries it open, first with her pocket knife, which she breaks. Then she ends up having to use nail clippers because when she starts getting the leather off, she realizes that there's plasticine. And of course, she's smart, and also she's a tennis player. And she immediately says to herself, why would there be plasticine at the end of the handle of the tennis racket? So she pries it off, and guess what falls out of the tennis racket handle, Kemper?
I think that might be a hollowed handle's worth of perfectly gorgeous, shimmering, glittering jewels.
Just maybe. She, stares at them for a good bit, but then she pretty calmly puts the racket back together. She ends up getting sort of adhesive bandage tape to redo the leather. So she puts it on in reverse. She's very clever about it. And then she ends up hiding the jewels in her bath bag, putting stuff on top of it, moves the dresser against her door so that nobody can get in. They do try to get in. The handle is rattled.
Someone tries to get into her room in the middle of the night. It's actually, I found this whole sequence of Julia prying open her tennis racket and then figuring out a plan as to what she is going to do about it to be extremely gripping and entertaining. I think for me, this was one of the best parts of the story.
Well, even better, because what does she do next, Kemper?
Well, come morning, she sneaks out, grabs a bus, and takes that bus to, wait for it, Whitehaven Mansions. That's right. And how does she know about our dear Hercule Poirot? Well, because her mother...
Good.
Oh, this is so good. Her mother is quite fond of one Maureen Summerhays, who we should all remember as the proprietress of a somewhat chaotic guest house that we visited along with Monsieur Poirot in Mrs. McGinty's Dead. And Maureen has just talked to Blue Streak, apparently, about Poirot. She has a lot of residual affection for him. And that affection seems to be very much mutual. Poirot's mind went back to a village that climbed a hill and to a house on top of that hill. He recalled a charming freckled face, a sofa with broken springs, a large quantity of dogs, and other things both agreeable and disagreeable. And then in the course of this conversation, there is also this just absolutely delightful exchange between Julia and Poirot about Maureen Summerhays. Yeah. So this is what Poirot asks. Did you enjoy the food? Well, it was a bit peculiar sometimes, Julia admitted. Peculiar, yes, indeed. But Aunt Maureen makes smashing omelets. She makes smashing omelets. Poirot's voice was happy. He sighed. Then Hercule Poirot has not lived in vain, he said. It was I who taught your Aunt Maureen to make an omelet. Oh, Poirot. Yeah, this is one of the more delightful points of connection between two novels.
Totally charming. And so also Poirot clearly also clocks immediately that Julia's very smart.
And that's the thing. Her resourcefulness is pretty astounding, that she's able to find the jewels, protect herself from a murderer within her dorm, get a ride on a bus, and find Hercule Poirot in London, all as a very young teenager. It's truly impressive, and he very much admires her. And she has the good sense to be both pleased by that admiration, but also embarrassed.
Right. And also, what has she done with the jewels? She has taped them, probably with the same tape that she was using to tape back the tennis racket. She's taped them to the inside of her thigh, which is like, good girl. Like, yes, like, of course, it's under her dress. Like, nobody's going to notice, right?
I'm so torn by this whole sequence in the book because it truly was one of my favorite sequences, because anyone other than Julia would not have made it out of Meadowbank alive. Like, she really owes her life to her brains, which is
it's Julia and only Julia who manages to do this, because
like Jennifer would have been dead in her bed, you know?
Correct.
But like, and it's very satisfying to watch Julia find her way to Poirot. And then we know Poirot so well that we're like, oh my God, she's safe. She's safe. This is so, oh my God. And now they're going to love each other and he's going to figure it all out. And it's lovely, but we are more than 2/3 of the way through the book. This is so late.
It's very, very late in the book. Yeah. It's like there are maybe, 50 pages left?
Apparently, it's going to be even worse with the clocks, which is a couple of books later. You know, some of these latter-day Poirots, she just barely has him in there. It's a bit half-hearted, if not quarter-hearted.
Him showing up here actually is effective. And we can talk about this in the rankings, because this really is like the one thing necessary. So to some extent, him showing up late is not a Deus Ex Machina situation. This is a very clever girl. Who realizes desperately she cannot get in contact with her mother. Mm-hmm. She doesn't quite know what to do, but she remembers who she could ask.
Yeah, no, it's not at all a Deus Ex Machina. It's wonderful how he's brought into the story, but it would be nice if she could have figured out a way to do that a little bit earlier on as well. I mean, it cuts both ways. It basically cuts both ways as to our series-long character scoring. So we'll get into it.
Well, but Poirot does exactly what Poirot would be expected to do, is that he hugely respects Julia. He takes the jewels, gives them to George. They're going to put them in the bank. And he goes back via car with Julia to Meadowbank. I also really like that Julia left a note, but that nobody noticed that she left a note until Poirot calls.
I know. She's so responsible. And then once they get back to Meadowbank, Poirot and Julia recount the entire story to Miss Bulstrode with the door slightly ajar. It's noted that Poirot does this for Julia's protection because at this point, the jewels are no longer in her possession. To a certain extent, the jig is up, so Julia does not have to be killed anymore.
Right.
And she also has no idea as to the identity of the person who was looking for the jewels / murdering Miss Springer and potentially Miss Vansittart.
Unfortunately, just prior to this, and more unfortunately from Mademoiselle Blanche, she's not actually entirely who she says she is either. And before Poirot and Julia can get back there, she's also killed, also with a sandbag. Because, as we'll find out, she was a blackmailer.
Yeah, she was blackmailing whoever was doing these dastardly deeds, or whoever seemed to be doing all of these dastardly deeds. So this is our second murder via sandbag. And can we just dispense with this odd side plot right here so that we don't even have to cover it when we get to our resolution? Because it's so bizarre and beside the point. But, you know, for anyone who hasn't read A Murder is Announced, I suppose, fast forward 15 or 30 seconds. But there's this a weird ripoff moment of A Murder is Announced where we find out that Mademoiselle Blanche is pretending to be her sister who had died because she just wants the money from the teaching position, and she's just kind of an opportunist who is looking to make as much cash as she possibly can in any situation, hence the blackmail, which she has just cottoned onto. So that's why she's been a bit suspicious throughout the book, and also a garbage teacher.
Right. Everybody just keeps saying that she's a terrible teacher, and then Mrs. Bulstrode is like, well, you always say that about the French.
Right. I don't know if I really needed that extra little obfuscation there, because it didn't even really function as an obfuscation. It was just kind of a noted side plot. And I was like, okay, sure. Just felt a little needless to me.
Yeah, I agree with that, because it's a little bit like she also could have been a garbage teacher who was a blackmailer, and you didn't have to know that she stole her dead sister's identity.
A bridge too far, shall we say. It reminded me a little bit of some of the earlier novels where, you know, Mysterious Affair at Styles and even Murder at the Vicarage, which we love, where she even talked about this, how she kind of overstuffed them with side plots. Again, turducken. At times, this book feels a little overstuffed, and this was definitely one of those times. And, you know, John Curran, we know that John Curran hates those late third murders in the latter-day Christies, and Mademoiselle Blanche's death is definitely one of those as well. But I had no problem with her murder, just with her backstory.
Right. And also, by the way, meanwhile, British intelligence has tracked down Mrs. Upjohn on a bus in Anatolia that is currently stopped. And she's like chattering away with some people on the bus, but it's per Poirot's request. And they basically grab her and say, sorry, actually, you have to go back to England right now.
Right. So we know that she's on her way back. And bear with me a moment, Catherine, but I think that you and our listeners will appreciate this slight tangent, because this was my favorite discovery that I made while reading this novel. So when we finally catch up with Mrs. Upjohn on this bus tour in Anatolia, here specifically is what she's up to. This is what Christie writes. Sitting by the side of the road overlooking a deep ravine, talking partly in French and partly with gestures to a large and solid-looking Turkish woman. And then we find out that this Turkish woman is telling her how she has 9 children, 8 of them are boys, and how she also had 5 miscarriages. And then Christie writes, she seemed as pleased at the miscarriages as she did at the births. And then the woman asks Mrs. Upjohn how many children she has. And Mrs. Upjohn truthfully tells her 1 girl, but then she lies because she knows that the woman is going to think less of her. And she has like a surge of national pride that she has to have a better showing than just having 1 girl. So she lies, and she says that she also has 5 boys.
Right.
And as I read this passage, I was like, why does this sound so familiar to me? And the reason why it sounds familiar to me is that this very thing happened to Christie, and she wrote about it in her breezy, diverting travelogue of a memoir. That's right, Come Tell Me How You Live, which was published in 1946, in which we covered on a recent previous Patreon episode. And here is how the real life version played out, because it's similar, although not identical. And it just tickled me to just kind of get a little behind the scenes sense of how Christie occasionally lifted these real life moments for purposes of her novel writing. At Haidar Pasha, I find I am to share a compartment with a large-sized Turkish lady. She has already 6 suitcases, 2 peculiar-shaped baskets, some striped bags, and various parcels of provisions. By the time I've added my 2 suitcases and a hat box, there is simply no room to put her legs anywhere. Seeing the large lady off is another slimmer and more lively lady. She addresses me in French, and we converse amiably. I am going to Alep. Ah, her cousin not so far. Do I speak German? Her cousin speaks a little German. No, alas, I speak no German, and no Turkish, and no Turkish. How unfortunate. Her cousin speaks no French. What then are we to do? How shall we be able to converse? It seems, I say, that we shall not be able to converse. 1,000 pities, says the lively cousin. It would have been interesting for both of you. But before the train goes, let us say all we can. You are married? Yes. I admit that I am married. And children? You have many children, no doubt. My cousin has 4 children only. But, adds the cousin proudly, 3 of them are boys. I feel that for English prestige, I cannot admit to being perfectly contented with 1 daughter. I add a couple of sons with shameless mendacity. Excellent, says the cousin, beaming. Now, as to miscarriages, how many miscarriages have you had? My cousin has had 5, 2 at 3 months, 2 at 5 months, and 1 premature stillborn child at 7 months. I am just hesitating whether to invent a miscarriage to enhance the friendly feeling when mercifully a whistle blows and the lively cousin leaps out of the carriage and along the corridor. And the story continues from there. Clearly very much lifted from Christie's own experience.
Right. Talk about personal conversations on public transit.
Yeah. And I mean, Christie is choosing to be very jocular about a subject that can be extremely painful for a lot of people. So I just want to acknowledge that. But that jocularity is very much within the text of her memoir and this novel.
Absolutely. But instead of like the bell ringing or whatever, it's the British showing up and telling her that she needs to get a move on it because they have an hour to get to a plane to get her back to England.
As Mrs. Upjohn is wending her way back to the United Kingdom, we are going to wend our way over into the world as it actually is by way of some clues. We should note up front that, this is definitely one of Christie's looser constructed puzzle mysteries, and she tended to, I think, have a bit of a looser construction in the second half of the of. This is not one of those tightly constructed puzzle mysteries from the 30s.
And if we're going to keep calling it a turducken, by which we also essentially mean that there's a frame narrative to it, thriller framework more than it is in the puzzle mystery framework. And so we're getting like a combination here. And so as a result, we don't necessarily have clues in the way that you might in a puzzle mystery, even though it's not distinctly a thriller.
Agreed. She, we've seen her marry the thriller and the puzzle mystery before with varying degrees of success. Like in a lot of those early thrillers, they're, 90% thriller and sometimes just very incidentally puzzle mysteries or whodunits. I think 1, 2, Buckle My Shoe is an example of a puzzle mystery that also has a thriller frame that doesn't work quite as well as this one. I think she actually pulls it off a lot better here, but it still can be a little bit awkward or feel a little bit stuffed, turducken style, even though I'm oddly describing that as a loosely constructed puzzle mystery. What we do really mean there is that there are 2 different sort of frameworks that are pulling in opposite directions. And for that reason, we can't just get to the solution by way of clues, I think, as coherently as we often can in a straightforward puzzle mystery. But have no fear, because we have a couple of clues that we are going to run through now. The first one just doesn't really necessarily lead us anywhere useful for a while, but I think it's worth pointing out because it is one of the few true clues that Christie drops a few times in this text.
Well, I'm going to be honest, it's a red herring, Kemper.
It's not. I mean, it's not a red herring because it explicates what's happening here. And it's a big one because it has to do with Princess Shaista, who seems to have been kidnapped. And we are told so many times in the course of this novel that Princess Shaista looks and seems older than she is. Here are just 2 quotes that I pulled out. The girl is fully mature. She might easily be over 20 by the look of her. And then another quote, quite a little actress. They talk about her brassiere and also her knees. Poirot in particular seems obsessed with Princess Shaista's knees, which is a little uncomfortable, but we know that we should take note of Poirot's preoccupation. So what does this mean? What this means is that Shaista is not a girl. She is yet a woman, Britney Spears notwithstanding. And Christie more than puts us on notice about this since it's mentioned so many times.
I have to be honest that I was unaware that knees were that big of an indicator of age. I mean, now they are because, frankly, at my advanced millennial age, I am finding it harder to, bend mine. But
well, here's the thing. Because this is what Poirot says. He says, knees are a very good indicator of age. The knees of a woman of 23 or 24 can never really be mistaken for the knees of a girl of 14 or 15. It's like, maybe, but
I just don't remember that being the case.
Well, the thing that I know is definitely true, is that I think knees and elbows, the issue is that the older you get, the more likely your skin around your knees and your elbows is to fold and sag when straightened. And I actually am obsessed about checking whether or not the skin around my elbows has started sagging and folding yet, because it's getting real close, but it hasn't happened yet. And I literally check it sometimes. I'm really bringing you all behind the veil here. This is embarrassing.
I know. I'm now very fascinated by this. I kind of feel like we should do an offshoot podcast that's solely on this topic, Kemper.
It is a thing. It's just that I don't think that knees would show their age by 23 or 24. I think it would be more like 33 or 34 or 43 or 44. So I think it's a bit much.
I have to say that even today I was like, oh, is there something really wrong with my right knee? And I thought, oh no, I have a Poirot knee.
Well, and I've actually noted my knees also. I'll just continue here with the personal information. My knees have little dry spots on them now, which is something that only happened in the last year or two.
Oh, I don't have that. It's just mostly that I feel like one knee is going to double out under me or something.
Well, you have something to look forward to, apparently, Catherine. And I have also noticed, again, you're right, Catherine, I apparently could really do an offshoot podcast about this because I have so much to discuss on this topic. But I do have a child, as has been mentioned a few times, and it is remarkable when you look at the knees of an infant to a 1-year-old, before they start walking, the knees don't really exist because the legs haven't been used yet. And you realize a knee is there, and the slight wrinkling and the kind of differentiation of the knee to the rest of the leg only occurs from the use of the leg. So he has a point. The wear and tear becomes noticeable more quickly on that part of the body than on others, but it's still a bit of a stretch. All it means is that Shaista must be in on it, so she's not actually being kidnapped when we think she's going to be kidnapped. And yes, that sounds as useless as it is, and we'll get there when we get to a resolution. But let's move on to more of a real clue, Catherine, which I'm so excited for you to share with us.
Because I always get this clue.
You do indeed.
This itself is also a little hard because basically what I'm about to say is never underestimate the help. But the help in question here actually is not at any point underestimated. There's a deaf cook at the school, but she's pretty savvy. The trope is only consistent here because we're primarily focusing on the teachers, the schoolmistresses, and particularly the three new ones, Miss Springer, Miss Blanche, and to an extent, Miss Rich. But the deduction here, if we think about that, is who is also an unknown variable, who also here is new, but because we've only been looking at the schoolmistresses, who's not being looked at directly. And you basically only have one option, and that option is a secretary and chaplain, especially if we pair it with our next clue.
Speaking of stretches of clues here, I've got two meta clues here that are just going to knock your socks off no matter how old your knees might be. So this meta clue here involves something strange that's going on with the odd blocking in chapter 14 of this novel. And that is when Miss Chadwick discovers or seems to discover Miss Vansittart, who's been sandbagged over the head. And Christie goes to great lengths in how she blocks this chapter. It's divided up into two parts, actually, which is also kind of unusual. She goes to great lengths to ensure that we know Anne Chaplin, the secretary, is at dinner. when this second murder is happening, like at dinner far away in London. Like there is no way that she is on the scene here and could have had any direct involvement in this second murder. So she is completely exonerated from that. And the deduction there is that, of course, that means Anne Chaplin couldn't have committed the second murder, which means either she definitely isn't the murderer at all, or because this is Christie and Christie loves to be devious after all, perhaps the second murder, that murder of Miss Vansittart, is unrelated to the first murder, and Anne Chaplin, who Christie is trying desperately to get us to dismiss, is in fact the murderer of Miss Springer, our first murder. I don't actually expect anyone to get there. This is all being done with the benefit of hindsight, but this is a little bit what we do on this podcast, so bear with me a moment here, because there is a corollary to clue number 3, and that would be our final clue number 4, also a meta clue. But we should be extremely suspicious of the blocking of Miss Chadwick discovering Miss Vansittart's body in this 2-part chapter 14, because if we read it carefully with our murder of Roger Ackroyd, be very wary of any omissions goggles on here, Christie never actually shows us Miss Chadwick discovering Miss Vansittart's body. We just assume that. We're told that she goes in, and then when we come back to her, she's relating what she saw to Inspector Kelsey, and she seems very, very upset. And the deduction here is that, of course, we should assume nothing in Christie, and that should put us on notice that Miss Chadwick may not actually, be as trustworthy as she seems, and that she, in fact, may be the culprit of this second murder. And that also puts a supernaturally astute reader on notice that perhaps the second murder has nothing to do with the first murder, or, as it turns out, the third murder either. I mean, I really defy anyone to get there. This is one of those moments where I would say if any reader legitimately was able to figure out this mystery without being told what happened at the end by Poirot, I would really love to hear from you, because you have just godlike powers of deduction. But we are a little bit closer at this point to our resolution, and I think it's time to find out what's really going on here. Take it away, Catherine.
Well, Mrs. Upjohn gets on that plane from Anatolia back to England. She ends up at Meadowbank, and we get to the denouement, and she basically immediately recognized the person that she saw out the window on that first day. Guess what? It's Anne Chaplin. Anne immediately pulls a gun, trains it on Mrs. Upjohn. Miss Bulstrode jumps in front of her, and Miss Chadwick jumps in front of both of them as the gun goes off.
It's quite the action-packed sequence, isn't it?
Yeah, and I would say, geez, you couldn't have just let the ladies stay on the bus? Oh, man, that's kind of sucks. She was
having a lovely Turkish trip to Turkey,
I know, and instead she comes back, and this is what happens.
Anne also gets a really bad potty mouth really quickly once the mask comes off. This is definitely one of those denouements where the killer unmasked just becomes not a psychopath, but a much more unpleasant version of who she was pretending to be.
Yeah, there's this whole weird subplot in this that we have not mentioned for pretty obvious reasons, where she has her whole boyfriend thing too.
Yeah, and she and Adam Goodman have a bit of a flirtation, and she talks about having a mother who seems to have psychotic episodes, one of which sounds suspiciously like Agatha Christie's own fugue state, where she ended up in a hotel. She actually, Anne Chaplin relates that happened to her mother.
That it's not Anne Chaplin's mother, that it's just this poor woman who's in a fugue state who she pretends is her mother.
Oh, it's all been made up. Yeah, no, that's what was so fascinating about that. We find out at the end that it's all lies. So it's interesting that, this fugue state that she related was clearly just a massive, massive falsehood. Interesting choice there, Agatha.
Yeah, it is. We find out she killed Miss Springer because Miss Springer caught her trying to search the girls' lockers. She killed Mademoiselle Blanche because she was being blackmailed by her. And guess who she did not kill, Kemper?
She did not kill Miss Vansittart because not only did she have an alibi, she had no motive. You know who did have a motive? That's right, Miss Chadwick. She killed Miss Vansittart out of blind rage over Miss Vansittart's entitlement because, as we mentioned, she was the heir apparent to take over Meadowbank, and Miss Chadwick felt very much overlooked by Miss Bulstrode, and even though she was the second in command, she had not assumed, but I think hoped that she would actually take over from Miss Bulstrode, even though she was of a rather advanced advanced age herself at that point, and Miss Bulstrode never even considered her for that role, which is kind of heartbreaking. So it just, she went out because she saw that someone was rooting around in the pavilion, and Miss Vansittart was actually doing that because she was actually trying to figure out whether or not she could find any clues as to what she thought was the kidnapping of Princess Shaista. And when Miss Chadwick saw Miss Vansittart in the pavilion and she was holding this sandbag that she had taken with her merely for protection, it was almost just in a blind rage or in a fit of passion. She just sucked her over the head with it, and obviously had a great deal of remorse after the fact. But that second murder, very ingeniously, was an outlier and had nothing to do with the rest of the plot. Yeah, with the rest of the plot. And Miss Chadwick, unfortunately, dies from her act of self-sacrifice, which, is a little convenient right after we find out that she is also a murderer. And Miss Bulstrode ends up naming Miss Rich, actually, the rather odd yet somewhat inspired Miss Rich, as her heir apparent. The other slight obfuscation going on here vis-a-vis Miss Rich is also cleared up, because we mentioned that she was ill and she had been away the previous term, and she just seems off and like something is bothering her. And what we find out is that she wasn't in fact ill, she was pregnant, and she had a baby out of wedlock. The baby died after it was born, and she's obviously been through a really tough time and is still sort of scarred from that and working her way through it. And she hasn't told anyone about it since, this is 1959/1960, and she's working as the schoolmistress at an elite girls' boarding school. We can understand why she wanted to keep that under wraps. But when she tells Miss Bulstrode about that, she assumes that, Miss Bulstrode's plans to elevate her as her partner are just going to fall completely, by the wayside. And Miss Bulstrode doesn't even blink. And she says, no, I still want you to be my successor and to work with me now that we have to rehabilitate this school where 3 murders have happened, because I think that you have a really interesting brain and an interesting way of looking at things and would be really good in the school. And it's a very refreshing, dare I say, progressive moment in this novel.
Yeah, well, again, Miss Bulstrode as a whole, she just rolls with the punches. And that's what makes her so interesting. I mean, it's actually the whole reason why she never actually wanted Miss Vansittart, because Miss Vansittart was like, well, we should believe in tradition. Like, you set up this great school. It should be exactly how you envisioned it. And her response essentially is like, yeah, but opinions change.
And that's why she ultimately goes with Miss Rich. And, we've been
and also Miss Vansittart is deceased.
She's also deceased, yes, so it becomes an easier decision. But we've talked a lot about that, but it's actually a large part of the book is Miss Bulstrode's musings on education and who she's going to pick and how she's become less engaged in Meadowbank because she's already established it, and how to carry on the tradition the right way with the right person. And it's interesting and engaging in the book. She's not less
engaged. She just makes the point that she realizes that she has to figure out a way to keep the school going on. And although as much as she doesn't feel like she's done yet, it's critical that she finds somebody to carry on and that she needs to create a transitional period.
Well, the funny thing, though, is that in the beginning, before any of the murders happen, she is less engaged because she feels like she's done it. And she's kind of at the end of her journey at Meadowbank. And that's why she's thinking about her successor. But in a weird way, these murders happening are almost a good thing because it's reinvigorated her and kind of re-engaged her, because now Meadowbank is not one of the top boarding schools in England anymore. People have pulled their children out. It's going to take years for them to rehabilitate their reputation. So the challenge has been resurrected and she's engaged once again, but she also does want to do that with someone else. So, I mean, she's just such an unusual character. And I love that, I love the way that Christie handles her just like from start to finish. She's very believable and engaging, and her preoccupation with finding the right person to work with her and just like her interest in education in general, it really comes through in the book and is part of what I found very engaging about the novel overall, and has nothing to do with the mystery or the international intrigue. And speaking of, we find out that the real Princess Shaista, never even made it to the school. And if you haven't read a short story we covered recently, The Girdle of Hippolyta, within the Labors of Hercules collection, fast forward like 30 seconds, but that story also took place at a girls' school. It was abroad. It had a Miss Bulstrode-like character, and it had this exact obfuscation at its center, which is that there was a kidnapping of a schoolgirl on her way to school, and the solution is that she was actually kidnapped before she even got on the train where she seemed to be kidnapped, and it was very much the same thing here. I mean, Christie wrote that short story decades before this one, but she must have been thinking about it when she was planning this novel, because those are two major commonalities.
Right.
And it's the same thing here. The real Princess Shaista was kidnapped in Switzerland. This was a French actress who was sent in her place. She was a lot older. She had some saggy garbage knees, apparently. And she was just hoping that someone would slip her the jewels, since the real Shaista was
right, because a lot of the people involved in this whole business thought that somebody would just hand them the jewels.
And the real jewels, of course, which, you know, have been sitting in this bank thanks to Poirot and Julia Upjohn, end up going to Prince Ali's secret English wife, who is this lovely seeming woman introduced at the very end of the story, very surprisingly. Not only is this woman the secret English wife of Prince Ali, but she's also the mother of his son. We see this boy who Christie mentions is, quote, an olive-skinned dark boy. His name is Alan. She obviously very much loved him, and she's very appreciative of the fact that she has these jewels, but she allows the jewels to be sold. She's going to put the money in a trust fund. She's going to save it for her son's education and a new way of life for herself, because she seems to come from somewhat modest means. But now she's going to be a very rich woman, because obviously these jewels are worth almost £1 million. But she does, you know, instruct that one jewel be left out and given to, quote, that schoolgirl, the one who found them. I'd like her to have one of them in gratitude for her safekeeping of the jewels and just, you know, general level-headedness in terms of getting everyone out of this mess. Because if it weren't for her, the jewels would definitely be in the hands of Anne Shapland, who I'm sure would have just sold them to the highest bidder. The jewels have ended up in the place where Prince Ali wanted them to end up at the beginning of the story, and Julia Upjohn is getting
the only thing that he wants at the beginning of the story is that he wants them to get back to England. And it really does come across at the beginning of the story that he would not have given up his place in his country if it weren't for something that mattered more to him. And so it kind of comes around in the frame of it nicely at the end when you find out that, oh yeah, it's not that it was just a revolution. It was not that he was afraid for himself, because at no point actually does he seem that way. But it just seems like he desperately wants for himself and for his best friend to get back to England.
And now we know why.
Yeah, I guess happy ending. I don't really know if that's a happy ending.
Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out, because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming. We should talk before we go into the rankings about the adaptation.
Absolutely. We only have one English language adaptation of this novel, which of course is part of our beloved David Suchet series. It aired in season/series 11, episode 2, first aired in 2008. It is written by Mark Gatiss. So excited that I know how to pronounce his name correctly. Thank you again, Mark Aldrich, for that. And I think it's quite good. One of its highest recommendations is that Harriet Walter plays Miss Bulstrode.
Right.
I've just been obsessed with her since she was Fanny Dashwood in The Ang Lee Sense and Sensibility.
My mother is always in excellent health, thank you. My brother Robert is in town with her this season and quite the most popular bachelor in London. He has his own barouche.
Her career started way before that, but that was my introduction to her, and she can just do no wrong. And she's done so much. I mean, she's just one of those English actors who is just in everything and anything, and she's fantastic in everything she does. I do think that Miss Bulstrode is a really tough character to bring onto the screen because you don't get any of those internal thoughts, but she does about as good of a job as anyone could, and I think she really works for the story.
She has the benefit, which I think was a smart decision, of having Poirot to play off of.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the big changes that's made, and it's entirely understandable given that Poirot doesn't come into the story until 2/3 of the way through, as Christie wrote it, is that he is brought in right at the top. He's presenting a prize on the school's opening day. That just puts him there. And then Miss Bulstrode also asks him outright to help her in her search for a successor, you know, to sort of observe and deduce as to character and who he thinks would be the best successor for her. You know, that does flatten, I think, Julia's character a little bit. And I found that Julia and Jennifer, you know, that goofus gallant contrast that exists in the text does not really exist here. They're both very nice, competent schoolgirls. So they're a little bit flattened as a result, but it's very understandable why Poirot is brought into the story as early as he is.
Right. I mean, the adaptation understandably just cuts a number of characters.
Yeah, there's actually no Miss Vansittart. So Miss Rich actually is the one who gets coshed in place of Miss Vansittart, and then she's not killed because, of course, she can't be killed because she has to be the successor at the end. That's absolutely fine. I had no problem with that simplification. Interestingly, Miss Springer is killed by a javelin that runs through her body, which is obviously a more dramatic and visual sort of a murder. It struck me as a bit big for the Poirot series, especially because in a flashback, you see that Anne actually throws the javelin at her. Like, I don't really understand how it's physically possible for the javelin to pierce as much flesh as it would need to kill her in that moment. But again, it's very dramatic.
I don't know. Are you super familiar with throwing a javelin, Kemper?
I'm not. It just didn't strike me as all that realistic as I was watching that flashback. It's actually funny. David Suchet mentions in Poirot and Me that this was a pretty gory Christie, and his evidence for that is that one of the murders happens via javelin, but that obviously is a change that Mark Gatiss et al. Made for the book. But no, I mean, I don't really have a big problem with it. The one other thing I just want to mention is that I really appreciated the fact that the woman playing Shaista does reappear later on in the story after she's been revealed to be much older, and Poirot explains the whole business with the knees. And we also see him, because he is at the school, he actually like goes down on his hands and knees and checks out Shaista as a schoolgirl's knees, which is a really weird scene. It's a little uncomfortable in the adaptation,
yeah.
But he explains what he was doing afterward. But I appreciate it, and it's this like really tiny modern gloss on the scene that I assume Mark Gatiss put, which is that Shaista laughs.
The knees are a very good indication of age, Inspector. For example, the knees of a woman of 24 or 25 can never be mistaken for those belonging to a young girl of 14 or 15.
She's basically like, okay, because it just is a slightly ridiculous clue. It just is. So I appreciated that he was acknowledging that. The only other thing I want to mention is that there is a French language adaptation within Les Petits Meurtres d'Agatha Christie. The adaptation was called Le Chat et les Souris, The Cat and the Mice, and it aired in the second season of that series in 2010. Just an FYI. Shall we talk about the rankings for this novel?
Yeah, let's talk about them.
All right, well, I would like to start out talking about our friend John Curran's opinion as to this novel, as I often do, because normally I agree with everything John Curran has to say, but I'd like you to guess, Catherine, which part of his pronouncement on Cat Among the Pigeons I took issue with. Here goes. Overall, the two distinct strands of Cat Among the Pigeons, the international and the academic, coalesce convincingly. If there is a fault with the book, it is the excess of female characters. Apart from Adam the gardener, all the other male characters are peripheral. This applies even to Poirot, although he would doubtless disagree. Despite this abundance of femininity, there is never any difficulty in differentiating between the characters. You can never have too many female characters in a book, as far as I'm concerned. I certainly did not feel that that was a problem.
Well, I mean, there's a reason for it. It's because we know from the beginning, from the frame narrative, that whoever did it was a woman. There's an unnamed woman who breaks into the hotel room in Ramat at the beginning, and so it has to be a woman.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about in 450 from Paddington how we knew that it was a man, and in this case, we do know that the culprit is a woman. So this is kind of
like the more adult women who could have possibly been in the Middle East at the moment this happened, like then you're going to have more suspects. And even then, I kind of think that you can really winnow it down pretty quickly.
Yeah, although she does her best to keep that suspect list alive, because Miss Rich, by the way, lo and behold, happened to go to Ramat to have her baby, right? So she actually was there as well. But that turns out to be a red herring.
I mean, I don't have a problem with that. I think the mechanics of it are fine.
Yeah, I think they're good. I think if we're evaluating this book on its own terms as this kind of slightly more loosely constructed puzzle mystery that also stitches together a framework of international intrigue, again, I think she actually acquits herself fairly well when comparing it to earlier novels such as 1-2 Buckle My Shoe and those early thrillers. And certainly They Came to Baghdad or Destination Unknown. She is pulling off both of those types of stories that she likes to tell, and I never felt like it was badly constructed in that way, even though this isn't a tight puzzle mystery. It's just not.
And to bring up the turducken analogy again, which our listener really didn't mean as a compliment, but I've now officially turned into a means of championing this book, you need 3 elements to create a turducken, right? And now that I think about it, I think the academic setting is actually the turkey, since it's the true outer frame. It's where we begin. And then the international intrigue is the duck, the middle layer. And while the puzzle mystery is the chicken at the very heart of the thing, if that mystery gets a little overlooked because of all that surrounding it, I find myself more than capable of forgiving Christie for that, since the book overall is so rich and delicious. Apparently, I'm going to need to make a turducken now. I suppose there's always Easter. But that's why I think I actually land pretty high, perhaps surprisingly high when it comes to plot mechanics.
Right. I mean, so where do we think we land here? Like a 7?
I think that a 7 is exactly right, Catherine. As usual, we find ourselves in agreement. And then when it comes to plot credibility, I think she does a little worse here because
you think?
The second murder, right? Miss Chadwick killing Miss Vansittart is eminently believable. Like, I get why she's jealous. I get how it happens. I think it's brilliantly explained. I'm there. However, the Jewel stuff, as it often is in the Christie thrillers, is a little silly. And the political intrigue.
All of the Princess Shaista stuff is dumb. It's just like, really? Like, who are these people behind this? Clearly it's some jewel ring because they're the people who break into Jennifer's parents' house at the beginning. We're assuming it's the same group of people.
It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And it's, often that's where these stories fall apart. But I do actually think just on the pure, like, politics of the revolution and her framing of, Prince Ali being Western educated, that's convincing.
Oh my gosh. Well, absolutely it is. And the fact that also when she's describing the sort of attempt at reforms, he tried to bring in Western reforms to a country that didn't want them. And they essentially revolted. The beginning descriptions actually about the crumbling forms of the sort of English kind of colonial, I mean, they're not colonial because he put them in place, but they have like clearly colonial influence, how those are the things that are falling apart in the capital. I thought was all like very well executed.
No, agreed. I was thinking more like a 5. I mean, possibly a 6, but I think probably a 5 for plot credibility.
I think like a 5. The Jewel stuff in England is just like so.
Yeah. Okay. So a 7 and a 5 for plot mechanics and plot credibility. 12 out of 20 overall for plotting feels right to me. Yeah. So then we get to what I think is without doubt the weakest category in this book, which is series long characters. Technically, these 2 characters we didn't even mention in our plot summary who figure in the international intrigue part of
of the book as secret agency type men working on behalf of the British government are series-long characters.
Colonel Pikeaway and Mr. Robinson are both series-long characters because they're both going to appear again in Passenger to Frankfurt, and Colonel Pikeaway is actually also in At Bertram's Hotel. They do both make an impression when they're introduced, one in a good way, one in a bad way. This is an example also, though, of the good writing in this novel. This is how Christie introduces Colonel Pikeaway. It was said of Colonel Pikeaway that his eyes were always just closing in sleep or just opening after sleep. It was also said that his name was not Pikeaway and that he was not a colonel. But some people will say anything! !
Well, no, and there's also a really good line later where Poirot is talking to Adam Goodman. And to essentially state his bona fides, Poirot is asking about Colonel Pikeaway if he is still always half asleep. And that's how Goodman also has faith in Poirot.
Yeah, totally. For a minor character, I felt like I knew exactly who he was, which is impressive. And then this is how she describes Mr. Robinson, which will also be coming up slightly in our Stuck in His Time category. The man who came into the room did not look as though his name was or could ever have been Robinson. It might have been Demetrius or Isaacstein or Perenna, though not one or the other in particular. He was not definitely Jewish, nor definitely Greek, nor Portuguese, nor Spanish, nor South American. What did seem highly unlikely was that he was an Englishman called Robinson. And then a few lines later, she mentioned that he has a yellow face, and at this point I'm like, oh, it doesn't get any worse than that, but we're entering dangerous territory in a Christie novel at this point, even though it could obviously be a lot worse. And then Mr. Robinson does make an appearance at the very end, too, when he's the one who gives the jewels over to Prince Ali's secret English wife and safeguards them and whatnot. So, they're there.
The biggest issue here is that there's very little Poirot.
Yeah.
My argument would be that I think that the Poirot that we get is utilized incredibly well, and that he's actually very good when he's on the page. He's just on very few pages.
Here's what I would argue. I think that it's egregious how late he enters the novel. Again, slightly more than 2/3 of the way through the novel. That's insane. I think it's the latest we've ever had Poirot or Marple enter a story.
I think so too. But again, as I said earlier, I actually like where he comes in, and I think it's well done. And I think it's well done how he's utilized in that regard.
It's well done how he comes in. Totally agree. He's also singing and jumping off the page in that initial exchange between himself and Julia Upjohn.
Right.
And we already went over it with the Maureen Summerhay stuff. At the very end of it, he also offers Julia a syrup and gives her like a choice of flavors, blackcurrant, raspberry, or grosse, which is red currant. I was just like, oh, Poirot and your syrups. Then after that, though, I think he recedes a little bit from the book even after that. He fits in, and like he's, he has to be there to figure out the international intrigue, and it's a fine fit. He's fine after that. I guess that first scene when they go back to Meadowbank and he's keeping the door open, that's good too.
I really do think that when he shows up, it's a well placed. I think he belongs in this book. I think that it packs a good punch, but again, he's almost a cameo appearance.
I came down super low. At first I was thinking like a 2, but I think that's a little ridiculous. Where do you fall on this?
I guess I would go under a 5 just based on relevance to the novel.
I would too. I would definitely go under a 5. If you're okay with it, I would land on a 3 with the acknowledgement that that is very low and something that very well may be goosed upward when we've,
I think that's probably too low, because I think that when he does show up, it's really effectively done. But for now, I guess we can say that. I think we should probably put an asterisk on it.
We can, I can be convinced to do a 4.
I'd be probably more inclined towards a 4, just because I do think
it feels
when he shows
right.
up. Yeah.
I agree. When I just said a 3, I was like, no, that still seems too low. Okay, let's say 4. Okay, so 4 for series-long characters. Then book-specific characters, I think in this book, Christie acquits herself really well. First, let's just start at the top. Miss Bulstrode, she's fantastic. But funny thing, when we were covering The Girdle of Hippolyta a few weeks ago, I obviously made the connection to Cat Among the Pigeons, but hadn't read it yet. And I pulled out of the recesses of my aged brain the name Miss Bulstrode without even trying. And I have not read Cat Among the Pigeons since my initial read when I was probably 12 years old.
I
remember
agree.
her.
Yeah, I agree. I think Miss Bulstrode, Julia Upjohn.
Julia Upjohn is great. And Mrs. Upjohn even. You know, a lot of these characters, they don't all get equal time or equal weight in the story, but most of them actually work incredibly well. Like, this is in a quiet way, I think, an excellent book in terms of character for Christie. Like, it's not one of the more obvious ones, but when I really sit down and I think about all the characters in this book, none of them feel flat.
No, Miss Chadwick. Miss Chadwick is also good. I mean,
she's fantastic.
Yeah, I think even Miss Springer.
Oh, Miss Springer is great. I mean, she's such a just delicious first victim, too. I mean, you know, I know that technically Bob and Prince Ali are killed off first, but, you know, she is the main victim in the story, and she's just such a great person to be killed off early in the story. She's just so deliciously awful. I mean, ironically, believable.
Ironically, the worst character in the story is Anne Chaplin.
I don't know if I agree with that. I thought you were going to say, ironically, the worst character in the story is the only man who's on the grounds, which is Adam Goodman. I mean, he's fine. He's a bit of a cipher, obviously, because that's literally his job. I do just have to, because I always love to gently rib Christie for her physical descriptions of men, but this is so another Christie hottie. This is what she writes. He was tall, dark, muscular, and had a gay and rather impertinent manner. I think what is keeping us as readers from knowing more about him and getting invested in him is the same thing that's keeping us. Yes, and that's the same thing that's keeping us at arm's length from Anne Chaplin, too. I mean, she suffers from the same kind of distant quality that we often get in The Ultimate Murderer in a Christie novel. I mean, fast forward if you haven't read Ordeal by Innocence or listened to, you know, our episode about that yet, but we had a similar issue with Kirsten, right? Because she couldn't really tell us all that much about her until she revealed what was going on. And I was like, I just don't know if I believe that character is a real person. And perhaps we get a little bit of that with Anne, but it was never an issue for me because Anne is literally like a super spy secret agent. Like, that's who she is, you know?
Yeah, I didn't care for that. Like, literally, like, you could have just killed her at the end and I would have been like, yeah, okay.
You totally could have killed her, but the funny thing is that what I remembered also from my initial read, I remembered Miss Bulstrode and her name, and then I remembered, oh, this is the one where the secretary did it. And I remember that specifically because of the scene at the end where she just turns into this, like, spitting, vitriol-filled harridan, and she actually screams, "You lying bitch!"
Yeah,
and it's all just, like, very over the top and ridiculous, but like also kind of effective. And the thing is, and this is going to transition nicely, I think, into our conversation about setting and tone, but that action sequence in which Anne shoots Miss Chadwick and, you know, everyone's running around and it's all just kind of like mayhem within this school. It's ridiculous and it's over the top, but then you get the sense Christie knows exactly what she's doing because it's contrasted almost immediately after with Mrs. Upjohn being reunited at long last with Julia, and then reading her rather heartbreakingly simplistic essay on Macbeth, which is just like really, really basic and like fine because, again, Julia is smart and she's still pretty young and she doesn't write very well. But like the contrast of those two scenes back to back is really effective and amusing and also evocative in terms of bringing the setting of this school to life. Yeah. So I don't know. I think Anne fits. She's filling the purpose that she needs to.
I guess. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with that, but where were you coming down overall on?
I'm coming down really high on this one, actually. I think we haven't actually done an 8 for book-specific characters in a while. We've done a bunch of 7s recently, and our last 2 for 50 from Paddington and Ordeal by Innocence, but I kind of think this one deserves an 8. I know that's surprising, but do you agree?
I'm skeptical about the Anne part. But again, we can reconsider it later. It's okay. I mean, I have enough affection for the other characters. And given that they're carrying the book, because we don't really have a series-long character doing so, I'm okay with an 8. I do have that problem with Anne.
No, I actually like that, though. It's true. The book-specific characters are really doing some heavy lifting here because Poirot is so absent. So let's give them their due. Let's give them an 8. And then, obviously, you know, on setting and tone, I think we have given quite high high scores to this category recently, and I think this one deserves a pretty high score as well. Christie, say what you will sometimes about her physical settings, I actually think she very successfully evokes this school with a lightness of touch. I mean, she's not giving us tons of physical descriptions, but I felt like I was in the school and I could see all the teachers and all the girls milling about and the sports pavilion and Miss Bulstrode's office and the way that they interacted. She has this great description of the schoolmistresses on the first day, basically in the teacher's room. And she writes, in the mistress's common room, news was being exchanged, foreign travel, plays seen, art exhibitions visited, snapshots were handed round, the menace of colored transparencies was in the offing. All the enthusiasts wanted to show their own pictures, but to get out of being forced to see other people's. You know, we really get a sense, I think, of the setting here.
Yeah, and I think the setting of them trying to get out of the Middle East is well rendered as well.
Yeah, the international setting is actually really well rendered. And again, you know, I mean, Christie was drawing on this real revolution that had happened in Iraq. She's obviously at this point been going to that area for decades, so she knows it really well. I think you can feel her assurance in painting those scenes early on in a way that you don't always with those scenes of political intrigue. Destination unknown, I'm looking at you. We even can see some interesting overlap, though, with those cases. I mean, I appreciated that there's an Arab peacefully clicking through a string of amber beads, which we totally saw when they came to Baghdad. It actually figured into the plot a little there. So, yeah, definitely, you know, I think A+ on setting. And in terms of the tone, as to readability, it's an odd one. It's an outlier. The chapters I noticed are titled.
Yeah, which is really odd for her. Yeah.
Which to me kind of indicated that she was taking a little extra care with this book, actually. I actually found it to be an incredibly well-written book because she is doing a lot of different things and she's putting together a lot of different pieces, but she's doing it successfully.
The pacing is actually really good in this.
Yeah, it never sags, even though it's loosely constructed. Right. And we often talk about that, like, oh, the book gets kind of saggy or baggy in the middle, or she's dragging the marsh or something like that. That definitely never happens.
No,
and I also appreciated.
And you know, we talked I think when we were talking about the plot mechanics and credibility, sometimes we correlate those with the tone because sometimes the mechanics of it are like, yeah, okay, we get it 30 pages in, and now you're going to give us another 100 pages before we get to anything relevant. That doesn't happen here at all. It really nicely paced.
Yeah, really nicely paced. And I appreciated that she was just like using a few more tricks than she normally does. There's one whole chapter that consists of letters from different characters.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I liked it.
Incredibly diverting. You know, she's trying some different things. She's done this before, but she's doing it particularly well here. So I just think this is, you know, easy breezy, effervescent Christie doing something slightly different, which in my mind is an A++. I think this deserves an 8 at the very least.
Yeah, I agree with an 8.
Okay. Let's go through Stuck in Its Time, the depictions that are stuck in its time that we might find uncomfortable. That's how we're going to try to refer to that moving forward. We've kind of mentioned this, but a big thing that this book has in its favor that pushes against anything being stuck in its time is that kind of progressive note at the end as to Eileen Rich having had this affair and having this baby, and she's never punished or even censured for it. So that's very refreshing. A lot of listeners have actually mentioned that to us already, that's one of the reasons why they have a lot of affection for this book, and I totally agree with that. I did cringe at this description of Prince Ali when he takes the jewels out, and this is the first time we see them. This is what Christie writes. He smiled, and suddenly the smile altered his face and made a different person of him. He was no longer the modern, conscientious, westernized young man. The smile held all the racial guile and craft which had enabled a long line of his ancestors to survive. Not great. And we also get that like slightly uncomfortable description of Mr. Robinson, which, you know, as I said, could be a lot worse. Yes, we do have the word Oriental thrown around a great deal, but it was much less offensive than it is now. That's a bit of a, you know, a sort of diction issue as to the time. And there is this weird gendered thing on the subject of the jewels themselves. So here's what the prince himself says a few lines after.
Are you saying that ladies don't love the jewels, Kemper?
I'm saying ladies might not love the jewels as much as Agatha Christie thinks ladies love the jewels. Here's what the prince says a few lines after he unearths the jewels or takes them out of that bag. Men are not the same when it comes to jewels. There's always a trail of violence to follow such things. Deaths, bloodshed, murder, and women are the worst. For with women, it will not only be the value. It is sometimes to do with the jewels themselves. Beautiful jewels drive women mad. mad. They want to own them, to wear them round their throats, on their bosoms. I would not trust any woman with these. Okay. And then even the uber-worthy Julia Upjohn is immune to the power that the jewels have over her, because when she unearths them and takes them out of that tennis racket handle, this is how Christie describes her looking upon them for the first time. In that moment, Julia grew up. She was no longer a child. She became a woman looking at jewels. I mean, as a woman, Catherine, do you relate to this? Am I missing something here?
I mean, I actually found it bewildering. That is not something that particularly, I like things that are pretty austere. So, no. But
like, I feel like Christie expects any woman, if they see like diamonds, to just go like, diamonds.
It's like you're gonna do full Marilyn and be like, diamonds are a girl's best friend, you know?
Yeah,
like,
it's just like, what?
Like, yeah, sorry, like they're not my best friend and I don't particularly care.
Yeah, it's more bewildering than upsetting. Obviously, it's just.
Although, by the way, gotta tell you, Kemper, if someone wanted to, you know, for my contributions to the mystery conversation, give me a mysterious, fancy emerald, I would not turn that down.
And we did have a bunch of offensive things that were put into the mouths of a number of characters, in particular Briggs, the gardener. That would be Adam Goodman's boss. But those are in the mouths of characters, so we always give her the benefit of the doubt there. So I think that this is one where it adds up to something, but not all that much, relatively speaking, when, you know, we're dealing with this issue in Christie, which is why one deduction feels right to me.
Yeah, that seems fine.
Okay. It is now time for the grand tallying up of Cat Among the Pigeons. We have a 7 plus 5 plus 4 plus 8 plus 8 minus 1 for a grand total of 31 points, putting Cat Among the Pigeons in a tie with Dead Man's Folly, which stands at 25th out of now 51 titles, and The Sidford Mystery, which is 26th. To me, that actually feels very right that it's sitting in the middle generally, because I do have a lot of affection for this title, but I don't think it's superlative. So I'm happy with its overall placement. How do you feel about its overall placement?
Yeah, I think that seems quite right.
I'm a little torn as to where I would put it. However, I honestly think there's an argument to be made to put it above both of those titles.
I think there's an argument to be made as well, but then I remember that I still do have that affection for Sidford Mystery.
Well, the funny thing is that we technically have Dead Man's Folly above the Sidford Mystery, but I feel pretty strongly that it's better than Dead Man's Folly, and it sounds like we maybe just need to, in our next rankings episode, switch the Sidford Mystery to Dead Man's Folly, which I think we did last time, so we might need to switch it back, but I think for that reason we kind of need to put it above Dead Man's Folly.
Yeah, that's okay. I think that next September, I think Sidford Mystery might be moving up a spot.
Yes, to be continued on our overall ranking. So then that puts Cat Among the Pigeons in 25th place among 51 titles. We only have 15 titles left, Catherine.
Aww.
I feel pretty good about that.
Yeah, I like it. I like it there.
All right, well, that is Cat Among the Pigeons. Join us for our next episode when we will be discussing
Tape Measure Murder. That would be a Miss Marple short story. We've been covering a lot of Poirot lately, and we're still a little bit away from our next Miss Marple novel, so we figured it was high time that we sat down for a spell with our dear Aunt Jane.
We also should just give readers an advance notice, because our next novel episode, which I think that everybody's looking forward to, is The Pale Horse.
Oh, I can't wait. I've been excited for that one for a long time.
I know you have, and I think a lot of readers have a lot of listeners have wanted our take on that. So we're very intrigued about that. Start reading.
In the meantime, we would love to hear from you. Let us know how you feel about Cat Among the Pigeons or anything else. You can email us at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. If you would like more content, because you just cannot get enough of us after this supersized episode, find us on our Patreon site, www.patreon.com/allaboutagatha. You can find us on Twitter at allaboutthedame. You can find Catherine on Twitter at brobcat. Our Facebook page is All About Agatha, and our Instagram handle is at allaboutagatha. And we would really appreciate it if you would give us a rating and or a review if you haven't already. And we'll see you next time. Happy New Year. Bye.
Bye. Happy New Year.
Have you made the switch to Knix? Millions of women have made the switch to the revolutionary period underwear from Knix. That's Knix. Period panties from Knix are like no other, making them the #1 leak-proof underwear brand in North America. They're comfy, stylish, and absorbent, perfect for period protection from your lightest to your heaviest days. They look, feel, and machine wash just like regular underwear, but feature incognito protection that has you covered. You can shop sizes from extra small to 4XL. Choose from all kinds of colors, prints, and different styles, from bikinis to boy shorts, thongs to high-rise. You've got to try Knix. See why millions are ditching disposable, wasteful period products and have switched to Knix. Go to knix.com and get 15% off with promo code TRY15. That's knix.com, promo code TRY15 for 15% off life-changing period underwear. That's knix.com.